sure we're running, and we are. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you today Pastor Kelly Chatman. And Pastor, I'm going to take this quote from something you wrote that I found on the web, and it says that Pastor Chatman has been in the Lutheran Church for a long time, and he has. He went to Lutheran high school, college, and seminary. He's a graduate of Gettysburg Seminary, and is currently the senior pastor of Redeemer Lutheran Church in Minneapolis. He has served as a leader at various levels during his career at the church and within the church. And as an African-American pastor, he served for 5 years as the director of youth ministries for the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and was also a distinguished church leader in Washington, Portland, Oregon, and again in Minneapolis. As the senior pastor of Redeemer, he's been the director of Redeemer's nonprofit entity, the Redeemer Center for Life. And this ministry includes things like affordable housing, after-school programs, youth outreach, economic and community development. And since 2004, Redeemer has been the location of a new and innovative hip-hop program led by David Scherer, also known as Agape. He is an advisor to the Reverend Ann Svenningson, Bishop of the Minneapolis Synod, and he's recently served on a whole number of boards, including the Wheaton Ridge Foundation, Plymouth Christian Center, Lutheran Volunteer Corps, and a neighborhood association. And we're proud to call Pastor Chatman's wife an alumni of the Thriving Fellows Program. She is the executive vice president at Concordia University, St. Paul. Pastor Chatman, thank you for being with us. Our topic is culture, and I'm going to go ahead, switch my picture off, and you can use the handout I emailed you from Pastor Chatman, but I'm going to show that handout here on my screen. So I'm going to go to that now. And Pastor Chatman, you have the floor.
Thank you for that introduction. And I'm here at Redeemer Lutheran Church, where I serve as pastor, and Redeemer Center for Life, where I am the director. And Redeemer Center for Life was started 20 years ago after the congregation surveyed the neighborhood and identified 3 things that the neighborhood wanted. They wanted more affordable housing, more youth development, and more employment opportunities. And over the last 20 years, the properties of the entire block, we built a new building to hold Milda's Cafe, which had been an anchor in the neighborhood more than 50 years. And Milda had been a member of the congregation. The congregation is 110 years old. And Milda, when her husband died, and she prayed that night, what was she going to do to feed her family? In her prayer, she said, well, I know how to cook. And she started the restaurant, Milda's Cafe, that has been an anchor here in the Harrison neighborhood of Minneapolis, for more than 50 years. The Harrison neighborhood is in North Minneapolis, which is historically, a stigmatized community, which many of our urban cities have stigmatized communities, and that stigma is attached to people of color and people of marginal income. And so the Harrison neighborhood has always been a wave of migration where people immigrated or migrated and could find affordable housing. We're close to downtown. And there have been waves when it was a Jewish neighborhood, and now that the neighborhood is, the demographics are 39% African American, 25% white, and about 17% Southeast Asian among, So it's a diverse neighborhood. But when I came up to Minneapolis, I realized and recognized that it was a community. You know, when you see something on the news, it's always references that the the negative things that happen in North Minneapolis, the deficits, and rarely is it promoted for the assets of the neighborhood. And along with that has been, and this is not just true for Minneapolis, but a history of disinvestment in communities of color like the Harrison neighborhood, and churches' flights from congregations as they become more brown, particularly in mainline denominations like Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian congregations. And I thought I was having trouble with my board. So that's kind of some of the background of our neighborhood. So when I took the call to Redeemer, after being in Chicago, directing youth ministries for 5 years, I imagined that when I got to Minnesota, they'd roll out the red carpet and I'd be in one of those, 500,000 member congregations. I interviewed in some of those congregations. By the grace of God, when I interviewed at Redeemer, I felt a sense of call. And Redeemer had a feel of a small neighborhood. I can imagine walking from my home to the church. Although my wife and I, we live 22 miles from the congregation, as we had bought our home convenient to my wife's job, where she continues to be employed as the executive vice president for diversity, and executive vice president and dean for diversity, excuse me. So, in talking about the part about diversity, one of the things that I say is size matters. And Redeemer was a congregation that had gone down to a critical point of critical mass, and is at the point of dying that the congregation asked itself the question, if they were going to die, that they were going to go out fighting. And so rather than simply seeing themselves as a congregation inside the walls of the church, they began to reach out beyond the walls of the church. And thus they did that survey, and that resulted in the establishment of the nonprofit. So now I'll start using this outline. So multicultural outreach. One of the things that I discern is it's critical that the church become relevant to its neighborhood. Historically, when mainline denominations, churches that came out of the ethnic identity of an ethnic church, when communities of color surrounded Lutheran congregations, the church did not become relevant to their lives. They weren't necessarily welcoming, I'll just leave it at that. The next thing that I've discovered during that time, and its story was, when I came to Redeemer, there was maybe 30 people in the pews, and I was preaching from this high pulpit, and I kind of had a bit of a crisis. I said to myself, what am I doing with my education, my salary? Why am I ministering to a congregation of 30 people? And in that moment of prayer, I hope this is God that said this, but that I was not ministering to a congregation of 30 people, but a neighborhood of 4,000. And that helped to reframe it for me, that the ministry of Redeemer congregation is not just who's in the pews, it's our whole neighborhood. So speaking to the concern and the issue of membership, I would say in certain contexts, it's critical that the church rethink membership. That if membership is based on who's there on Sunday morning, who's paying the bills, then that's a framework that I say is a losing proposition for many congregations, particularly in the urban context. And so there's a saying, I think it's from Young Life, that says you have to earn the right to be heard. And so our relevance, being present in the life of the neighborhood and in a more diverse settings, is critical to what it means to be vital and vibrant as a church. The next frame I have about pollination is being out to those places where people's lives are impacted. And an example is 8 out of 10 people that come through the doors of Redeemer are non-church members. And Sacred Places out of Philadelphia that does research about church buildings says that typically in a typical congregation, 6 out of 10 people that come through the doors of a church are non-church members. But at Redeemer, that number is 8 out of 10. And a Redeemer congregation is about 30% people of color. And well, I don't remember where I was going to go with that. But so that diversity, important. Oh, and that through a nonprofit, and it's 9 out of 10 people that come through the doors of Redeemer are African American, whereas our congregation is about 70% white. And we also, Redeemer comes through very high in the evaluation of vitality, based both on the Holy Cow research survey and also with the ELCA survey on vitality. So there are strong markers that something that we're doing in reframing the church and how we're doing church have signs of vitality. Another thing, and this is what attracted me to Redeemer, more so than the setting, was that when I heard Redeemer's mission statement, that the congregation's mission is to be a beacon of hope. And so seeing that and the relationship, the Redeemer is not a standalone congregation, but in relationship with our synod and the broader church. So there's a framework. So when I was doing my clinical pastoral education at the Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C., excuse me. I found this extremely helpful. There was a gentleman that came and met with our CPE class, a gentleman named Dr. Edwin Nichols from the National Institute of Health. And Dr. Nichols said that in the United States, people operate out of 3 basic worldviews. He said that for African American, Native American, and Hispanic people, the dominant worldview is relationship. So how I feel in relationship to my environment, how I feel in relationship to other people is fundamental to how I feel about myself. So with that beginning worldview, it said in one worldview is not better than another worldview. Then Dr. Nichols said that for Asian people, and again in the framework of the United States, the dominant worldview is following the emperor, respect for the elder. And with that worldview, things like conformity are fundamental to the Asian worldview. And again, one worldview is not better than another worldview. Then Dr. Nichols said that for white people, in the framework of the United States, the operative worldview is acquisition of object. So things like, how much do you know? How much do you make? And so that has been a really helpful framework for me when you talk about, on the negative side about that, of thinking about why might Sunday morning be the most segregated hour of the week? Thinking about how people come with a framework of a particular worldview. And so thinking about, so I've taken that model of worldview, and I've been able, I could ask a group of 50 young people, how long is a Lutheran worship service? And the typical answer I get, it's an hour. And then I can ask that same question of an African American Latino Baptist church and ask how long is a worship service, and I get the answer, it takes as long as it takes. So if you look at that framework and you look at Sunday morning and how we are acculturated out of our particular worldviews, that a worship service is supposed to be a certain time, and time is a commodity that you don't waste. And so that framework of 1 hour has a particular value for white people in a Lutheran congregation and a particular value for African American Latino people. And so if people expect it, and we say that we want diversity in our church and in our worship service, but it has to fit into the white framework of worldview around time, then what does that say? So another way of looking at that is if we look at our hymnals and our hymnody, and by the way, I overheard a seminary professor who said that hymnals are forms of ancestry worship. So if you look at our music in our hymnody in an African American tradition, one doesn't necessarily have to have that accumulated knowledge about how to do music, right? About how to sing. But if you look at a Lutheran worship service, and I'm very critical of our ELW, our hymnal, that if you don't have the acquired ability to sing music in 4-part harmony or whatever that is, then it's a setup, is what I'm saying. And I'm giving you my point of view and my critique. And what I feel like my experience as a Lutheran over many years is about deconstructing what does it mean to be Lutheran in terms of our practices. And are those practices supporting our values or our aspirations to be a more diverse church? So let me continue with this framework of worldview and looking at our worship service. So I live in Minnesota, and in Minnesota we have these amazing choirs. And the more complicated the music, the more they drool. And so then those graduates of those universities then populate our Lutheran colleges. And the expectation is that our congregational choirs are going to be at that same kind of level of proficiency. So again, that's moving us even further away from our aspiration to be diverse. So that's just the framework of, we talk about time, we talk about music, and then let's talk about how we're taught to preach in our Lutheran context. And that in an African American context, a sermon may or may not have a point. Amen? 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 So that's an invitation into relationship. So, but then what we're taught in our Lutheran seminary is that a really good sermon is going to have 3 points. And we have an acquired ability to listen. And so I know that I'm taught that if I haven't received a point or 3 points out of a sermon, I didn't really get a good sermon. But in another context, if it's just about that refinement about the point, I might not get what I'm looking for. So worldview is really important in the context if we're talking about diversity or multicultural. So, and much of what I'm talking about is that at Redeemer, we're really fortunate in that we have a nonprofit. So everything that we do isn't just what happens on Sunday morning, but how we're able to be in relationship with the community 7 days a week. And so what people experience Monday through Saturday is complemented by what they hear on Sunday. Or maybe it's the other way around, that what people hear on Sunday is informed by what happens in the activities during the week. So another thing is, I think we have to address the issue of race and racism. So in Redeemer's context, we've been here 110 years. Many of those years, the congregation was not really seeing the diversity of the neighborhood as an asset. And so turning that around, a couple of years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, our neighborhood association discovered a map. And that map was from our city planners. And that map defined different neighborhoods. And Redeemer's adjacent neighborhood was defined as Negro slums. And then there were neighborhoods further out that were called the Gold Coast. And so that kind of set up about what communities and who is valued are signs of success. I guess where I'm going with that is to say that a lot of what we're struggling with when we talk about diversity or multicultural has been framed by the empire. It's been framed by race and class and privilege. And so if the church is going to be relevant, we've got to roll up our sleeves and become more engaged in the struggles of people and informed, and moving from seeing people as deficits or neighborhoods as deficits to an exploration of how are they assets. And that to me is the framework of the gospel and the framework of the church. And so just a little bit more about Redeemer. As Redeemer, 20 years ago we had like 30 people. Now we have, we have doctors and lawyers. We have 80-year-olds who are graduates of St. Olaf University. One woman whose husband was the academic dean at St. Olaf, Shuni Hartwig, whose husband died at an early age. But they've lived in other parts of the world, and they've come back, and they don't want to be in a homogeneous Lutheran congregation. So they're looking for a worship experience that looks more like the world. Now, that's not to say everybody's looking for that, but if the church is going to be, if the church has a future, there's got to be more options than just that traditional ethnocentric white church body. Can I pause there and see if there's any? And I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. I'm not just using the PowerPoint.
Pastor Chatman, this we will do the IDI and also take a look at some of these issues as we go from the mid-year retreat into the final retreat. So I can send this reference out, but this is a great book.
Yeah. Well, let me say a little bit about our staff. So I'm the pastor of Redeemer, and I've been here 19 years. My sister came here 18 years ago to do our housing, and she became ordained a little over a year ago. And we mentioned David Scher, who's a member of the congregation, not on our staff, but he and his wife and 2 children are members. David Scher is, he's like the hip hop Christian gospel artist. And an example of David Scher as a member, not on our staff, when about 15 years ago, when rap music became popular, David Scher, when he was at Gustavus College, had a love for rap music. And what David did is he took the Lutheran worship service from the Kyrie to the benediction, and he translated it into hip hop. And then it started doing worship services with that. So a story, now this is the worship part of this. So we had 200 young people that were doing a hip hop worship service every month. And part of that is I was invited to do communion for that. And so as these young people are experiencing the gospel and doing hip hop worship service, and we did communion, and I'm administering the communion. And so I came through the Missouri Senate wonderful educational system. So I'm administering the sacrament. And here are these children coming through to receive communion. And I noticed a couple of the African-American children from the neighborhood are coming through the line for the second time. So in my mind, I got this great Lutheran theology that says, in the administration of the sacraments, if you don't do it appropriately, you're doing it to your own damnation. So I'm standing there in this critical moment of what do I do? Now, there's no easy answer for this except to say, standing at that intersection of how we're taught and what is right and proper and here's the gospel of these children coming forward. I would say more than anything that I say to you, that's the intersection that the church is called to be into. You know, the rules and all of those things and how we've been shaped and formed, but how is God coming to us in the everyday reality of the here and now? So I share that story. So another thing that David shared did, and along with some of the other young adults who accompanied him, and this is when rap music was anathema, right? So nothing good could come out of rap music. But what David shared and our young people did is they had young people pick out their favorite Bible verse and translate it into hip hop. So embracing the vernacular of the young people of the community. So that's what it really means to be the church, moving into that place of identity and the community. And that, again, our mission being to be a beacon of hope in the neighborhood. And one other story. So when I came to, I'm just laying it all out for you. So when I came to Redeemer, there was an African-American businessman named Kevin Lacey, owned several buildings in the neighborhood. And when Mr. Lacey saw me, he called me the Black Klansman. Now, this is before the movie. And it was not a compliment that he was calling me the Black Klansman. But his critique was, he never saw, when we built the Milda's restaurant and apartment building, he said he never saw people of color, being employed. When he saw people coming through the doors of Redeemer, he didn't see people of color. And so his critique was that we were not a part of the fabric of the neighborhood. I started having coffee every week with Mr. Lacey. And Mr. Lacey had a confectionery that was across the street from the neighborhood. It was a really good-looking popcorn shop, and it had been closed. And so we rented that building from Mr. Lacey, and we started doing our youth after-school program. At the same time, the drug deals were being done right across the street, open drug deals. And so when we started doing our after-school program, there were 3 Latino children, little girls, who were in foster care. And one day, one of the little girls asked of our youth director, "Is this a church or a magical place?" So is that movement into what is God doing and what is our movement into the community? So moving from, and I'm speaking for myself, and I was bound, wonderfully trained by the Lutheran Church, but I was also culturally bound. I was taught how to be a pastor for white people, how to be a pastor for white congregations. And so engaging the community, and when I talk about deconstructing, being reformed and reshaped to how to be relevant and how to be a leader within my context, it isn't all what I bring to the congregation, it's also what the congregation and the community bring to me. There are a good number of people who say that they're members of Redeemer congregation and they've never been inside the sanctuary. And that's a really important public statement of church that I embrace and would encourage for others. So I mentioned membership. So in the context of worship, and I do want to talk some more about the nonprofit, but I also want to say that from my experience, from being at Redeemer, it will really help to recognize that within the church is also a framework of entitlement. There's an entitlement about who sits where, who gets to choose which hymns we sing, and the really big one that gets at the heart of things is who gets keys to the kitchen. So we have the after-school program, and invariably, if the kitchen is left in disarray, that's the end of the world in relation to our after-school program. But if one of our members leaves the kitchen in disarray, it's not an issue. So being able to see those places where that kind of entitlement that says that there are insiders and outsiders. There are people who matter and people who don't matter. So I say all that to say an experience that I had after worship. So one Sunday after worship, after I preached, one of my members came up to me and was complaining because people in the back of the church, they were talking during the worship service and they were eating potato chips. And immediately I started to put on my potato chip cape. I started to walk to the back of the church and I catch myself. I say, there are people at the back of the church and they're talking and they're eating potato chips during worship. And instead of thinking that I need to go and chastise those people, I need to remember that there are people in church who don't know how to do church. And that's not a failure, that's a sign of our success. Now, I was not trained or oriented to think that people eating potato chips in church is an asset. So I think we need to rethink who do we value and who is our worship set up to value. And I'm not talking about the core value of worship, but I'm talking about the cultural part of worship. So at Redeemer, we have grown. You know, Mark Hansen, our Bishop Emeritus, is a member of our congregation. We have several other pastors that have joined our congregation. We're really a diverse congregation from illiteracy to literacy. We've grown in the number of young adults who are coming. We have 27 housing units. We have a bike and coffee shop. We have a bread oven. We have a community garden. We anchor 3 blocks of property and programming. And so there's a dynamic here that is it's a visible representation of the church. And my prayer is it challenges people to reimagine in North Minneapolis, what does it mean to be a Lutheran? That we're relevant, that we're relational, and that we're more than the church and the stigma that Garrison Keillor was so prominent in describing. And so it's a broader, newer expression of the church. So we do block parties. So for the last 18 years, we've done an annual block party. We have more as 800 people show up for our block party. During Black Lives Matter, there was a conflict between the police and the Lynx basketball team. And the chief of the police union, when the Lynx women's basketball wore Black Lives Matter t-shirts, he had all of his officers leave the Lynx stadium in protest. So there's acrimony between the chief of police, the police union, and the community. And so one of our leaders, a gentleman, African-American gentleman, and Elder T. Williams, suggested that at our block party that we invite the chief of the police union to come to the block party. So the chief of the police union came to the block party. Now they're in uniform. He's got like 4 of his fellow officers with him. And you could feel the tension at the block party. But as the time went on and their relationship built, there was some reconciliation. And so as I was going up to the stage to have the chief of the police union, Bob Kroll, come on the stage and give a greeting, one of our members said, "Can you believe that the chief of police union is at our block party?" And I was going to say, yes, I can actually, because we're the church. So it's that kind of presence that the church has. And a lot of it is because we're not just a church inside the walls of our congregation. So along with our staff, we have about 15 young adults that live in our housing in the community. And part of their rent is they volunteer in the community 5 hours a week. And those young adults are coming from Augsburg College, St. Olaf College, Luther College. Those are the primary colleges that they're coming from, and Concordia. And so we're populating the neighborhood also with leadership. But the important thing about that is the neighborhood is getting to experience the church, not just on the turf within the walls of our sanctuary, but on the turf of the neighborhood. And so we're doing workforce development, youth youth programming. We have artists. We have incredible artists from the neighborhood that are displaying their art. So we have the Mildus restaurant and a retail space that we call the living room, where Fairview Health has a health commons, and that's one space. And then we have the church and our apartment buildings and the bike shop on another space. And then where we built some affordable home ownership on the next block. And so we're displaying art by local artists. So we're transforming our building spaces also into art galleries where local artists are able to display their artwork in the church. And one of the reasons I think that's important is that for the congregation and for the community, it communicates that the ownership of the church is not just the people who are here on Sunday morning, but they have those pictures of people that are more representative of the neighborhood that are displayed throughout all of our buildings. So I'll just one last piece that I think is a framework on this PowerPoint. Tom, do you see the place on the PowerPoint where it talks about the cycle of oppression?
Let me see if I can get down to that. Okay, let me go back up. Biblical.
I hope that I sent it. Okay, well, this is it. It doesn't have the picture. So there's something called the cycle of oppression that was established by the Oakland Men's Project in Oakland, California. And it talks about, at the top of the cycle, it says that targeting. Targeting also means stigmatization. So you take a person or a group and you target them or you stigmatize them. And then the next part of that, it's counter clockwise. The next part of that cycle is misinformation. So you target a person or a group, and then you attach misinformation to that person or group. An example is North Minneapolis. And North Minneapolis is a place of crime and problems. And then based on the misinformation, then the next part of the cycle, the bottom part, is that's the justification to to justify mistreating that person or group. So North Minneapolis is a problem area. That's a misinformation. The justified mistreatment is don't go there. Don't invest in North Minneapolis. Don't have your church in North Minneapolis, right? And then the final part of that cycle is what's called internalized behavior. So if I have a dog, and every time my dog does something wrong, I'll approach my dog, and even though it didn't do anything wrong, it will act like it did something wrong. That's an example of internalized behavior. So in the example of North Minneapolis, as a targeted community, the misinformation is it's not safe. The justified mistreatment is don't invest there, don't build your church there, don't put your business there. Then the internalized behavior is then North Minneapolis acts out of that stigma, and so there'd be higher crime or people not treat each other the ways that they would in other communities. So on the framework under targeted, if you look at Black, Hispanic, or male youth, and you walk through that cycle, and you look at misinformation about Black, Hispanic, male youth, and if I'm a policeman, then the justified mistreatment is, are you familiar with the term driving while Black? Racial profiling. Are you guys awake?
Yeah, we got it.
So if that's the example there of racial profiling, then the internalized behavior then of Black, Hispanic, male youth might be to do crimes or to act out of that cycle. Do you get that? I don't think you do. Okay, let's do another one. So females as a targeted group, misinformation about females might be, it's hard to do this when you guys are like so far away, right? So I'll try it. So I'll spoon feed you. Normally I want this to be interactive. So just like, so if you're talking about driving, the misinformation that women are not good drivers. The justified mistreatment is then men would drive for them, right? And then the internalized behavior. My mother never drove because it's so internalized that she couldn't be a good driver. Right? You get that? So another example is like if you go to the magazine store, the grocery store, and you look at the magazine racks, and what do women look like? They look really thin, right? Or they look emaciated. And then the misinformation is that if you're not thin, you're not attractive, right? And so the internalized behavior can become anorexia, bulimia. So
yeah, and it's a feedback loop.
It is, and it becomes a perpetuating cycle. But what we do is we blame the victim, but we're the ones that set that up. Why this is so important and why I really like to use this, I'd use gay, lesbian, transgender in that cycle. So you look at that cycle, and I challenge people to think about Jesus, and that Jesus wasn't a nice guy, but Jesus, and you really look at those stories, those biblical stories, and Jesus is actually the Son of God who comes into the world, and he's confronting the cycles of oppression. So you look at the story and the model of the woman at the well. And the woman at the well is, the misinformation is all the relationships that it's her fault, all the ways that she's destroyed relationships. The internalized behavior then are the jokes and all the abuses that she goes through. And then what does the woman do? The last place she wants to go is that well. And so when does she go to the well? At the hottest part of the day, when she's going to be able to avoid anybody being there, because the last thing she wants to hear is how awful her life is. So I just want to challenge you that when you talk about and think about multicultural, please look through this, use this cycle to talk about the people that are stigmatized, the neighborhoods that are stigmatized, and the ways that we are participating in that, but also the way as people with biblical agency to confront the cycles of oppression.
Pastor, another person we use that we'll use in the next retreat and as we close is Ibram Kendi's work now on the economic aspects of oppression too. So we'll use some of his work.
Yeah. For me, this cycle is really good because I can go with any audience and go through this as exercise, and they don't have to bring in literacy or that they've read a book. I mean, we're living this stuff out every day. And so this is a way that people can do their own assessment and bring their own experience, and you can lead them through a conversation about this. But the trick of it is to go back to the biblical piece of that, to be able to see the real Jesus, who's the Son of God, and he's coming to confront systems of oppression. Here's one that I haven't used before, but I would say when President Trump talks about countries as outhouses, that's this cycle, right? And so you compare this cycle where the president talks about Kenya and Haiti as outhouses, but then what he does is parallels that by talking about Norway as the antithesis of that. So they actually have a conversation about the ways that we've come, what frames us to value some people and not others, some communities and not others, some congregations and not others, and some countries and not others. So that may be more than what you paid for this hour, but
I'm gonna stop the share just for a minute, Pastor Chatman. And I have a question for you, and I think it's one of the hardest things our church and institutions do. And we go through this both on the higher education side and in this church leader side, is that our institutions, our colleges and universities, when they were first founded in these immigration paths, were exactly the opposite of this. They were about preserving cultural identity. If you came from Central Europe or Norway or Denmark, you went to a Lutheran church, you sent your kids to Lutheran schools, you sent them to a Lutheran college, and it was all about preserving that cultural identity. And today, we're in a different place in the world than we are, and I think some of the struggles are we got people still living 100 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and again, I've been Lutheran for a long time, and I've been blessed to be Lutheran and received a wonderful Lutheran education. But my struggle throughout all of that has been that the inability of Lutherans, and it's not really Lutherans, it's white people, to translate the values that we have for white people, to translate that as a value for everybody. And so white privilege is a reality, and white supremacy is a reality. And the reality is our church hasn't translated those same wonderful values that we've had for our Lutheran congregations to new communities. And I'm talking about wonderful, good Christian people have not translated that to a global gospel and a worldview that's really, truly there for everybody. So hopefully we're moving more in that direction.
Pastor Chatman, is it okay if we open it for questions?
Absolutely. I got 10 more minutes.
Okay.
I've got a question for Kelly.
Hi, Dean.
Hi. Kelly, I'm wondering, this might be difficult, but to ask you to stand beside yourself and look at you as a person, what's necessary for a leader to be effective as we cross cultures? What does there have to be in a leader in the church today to be able to do what you're doing, or at least an analog to what you're doing in terms of crossing a culture and ministry?
I think to walk with the people, to accompany your congregation, your neighborhood, whatever it is, it's about accompaniment. And it's not what we bring, but what we share in our communities. My prayer when I left Chicago and being the director for youth ministries, my prayer was, could I be a good pastor? And Redeemer, this congregation has taught me how to be a good pastor. There are plenty of mistakes that I made, and ways that I'm a victim of this very thing. So when I came to Redeemer, they began the worship service with a time where a prayer and praise for half an hour, where you share the microphone, and people would share what they had to pray for. And when I heard that first one, I immediately thought, well, I'm getting rid of this. Maybe we can do this some evening. There's too much vulnerability. This is not going to work in a worship service. And I met with a leader from the community, and that leader from the community said to me, a lot of people that come to Redeemer, they come from the mental health system, and they come from the projects. He said that time when they have that microphone is the only time in a week when they have a voice. So he taught me what was sacred. That's not the value that I came here with. I had to be taught that. So I think our seminaries, and this is a critique, and it goes back to the worldview thing, that we've been taught, and it's a Western thing, that it's about how much we know, and systematic theology. And so to a fault, we've so invested in that at the expense of relationship. And so that to help people learn how to walk with their congregation or their neighborhood. And there are people that do that, but it's not necessarily a part of our training.
Great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Yes.
Go for it.
So I was happy to hear you talk about mistakes. We have focused on failure and, talking about failure. And I wondered if you had some other stories there or some stories of key turning points in the 19 years that you've been there.
Well, I don't, there may be key turning points. So I'll tell you another mistake that I made about worldview. So we had an after school program, and some of our African-American kids brought a couple of Hmong children to the after school program. And I was like all excited. I thought, okay, we're more diverse now. We're getting someplace. And then one day a Hmong dad came into the church, and he was sweating and he was really upset, and he was looking for his two children. And I thought, I was proud of myself. I said, oh, chill out. Oh, they're right upstairs. And so I thought that I'd solved it. And he looked at me and he said, how could you? How could you have my children in your program and you didn't have the decency to come and ask me? So I didn't understand the Asian worldview about respect for the elder. So those kind of mistakes. I have a huge tension in that we have some of our members who are, their idea and love for the church is the church that they grew up on the farm, and the church council looks like what it did when they were growing up on the farm, and they don't know how to move over and allow the church council to look like it does in the current context, because they're so loyal and faithful to what it looked like by the elders who handed it down to them. That's a real place of tension, because that's such a narrow picture of what leadership looks like, and it doesn't create opportunity. Another one you asked for, we had our annual meeting a few years ago, and there's a woman from the neighborhood who had come to worship for the first time, and we went down for our annual meeting, and nobody was running for vice president, and so this woman who had come to worship for the first time saw that there was a problem, and she raised her hand and said, I'll do it. And then all of a sudden, nobody wanted to take the position, but because somebody had not been here before, they said, the Constitution and all the reasons that she couldn't join the church council. Well, I understand the rules, but is that our value or our mission statement? So I was in disagreement with the congregation. I mean, it didn't matter that I disagreed. I didn't get what I wanted, but that tension about how do we move into this new reality if we are adhering to old rules? And so, I mean, I can tell you a lot of those stories about, and I don't know if that's answering your question. Success, with success that we have an uncommon number of young adults that are joining the church. We have young families. We have, there's a couple from St. Olaf College that have never been a Redeemer. They're buying a house in the neighborhood. They said that, and they called to schedule a time for baptism because they're going to be moving into the neighborhood, and they've heard good things about Redeemer. And so I've never had an experience of that where somebody calls up to say that they want to join the church, they want to be baptized based on what they've heard from someplace else. I think that's a success. I mean, there's so many of those things. It's a success that we're still here. I really mean that. Another one is a few years ago during the housing crisis, there was a house across the street that went into foreclosure. A company bought it for pennies on a dollar. And the next thing we know, there's a big piece of plywood on that building, and they simply spray painted a 1-800 number for sale. And so it's like, what an affront to do this in our neighborhood, excuse me, and to do this across the street from a church. Why wouldn't they have enough regard to put up a decent for sale sign? Mm-hmm. So we bought that building, we tore it down, and we built a brand new duplex. And now we have those 6 young adults that are living in there and volunteering in the community. So, I mean, there are multiple stories like that. We have 5 members from our congregation that are on the board of the neighborhood association. So what it means to be church and how we're known isn't just what happens in our building, but how we are part of the fabric of the community. I mean, there are a lot of those, the bike and coffee shop, the diversity of our neighborhood and our community. And I see we just have a few more minutes, so I better, anything else?
Well, Pastor Chatman, on behalf of all of us, we want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us. And I really appreciate that somebody else doesn't get 4-part harmony. Somewhere in my Lutheran world growing up, I missed that whole thing. And I still don't get it, why it has to be so complicated. So,
yeah, if I can add to that, so we have amazing music. So, and in our worship service, like when it comes to passing the peace, it takes at least 10 minutes. And again, that's that multicultural piece of that. But we have amazing music. So our musicians are like 35 years old. Our vocal leader has her degree in voice from the Berklee School of Music in Boston. Our piano player has his degree from Northern Iowa. I mean, we have talent. It's just that we do things differently than out of like we just got off the boat. So I know you're going to talk about innovation at some point. That's an important part of this too, to dare to do things differently than they've been done before. And then lastly, to focus on the assets of the community rather than the deficits. That too is liberating. So McKnight and Chatman do some great work on that. So anyway, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we will have the recording up probably in a couple days, and I'll send an email out. And again, thank you, Pastor Chatman. Take care and blessings.
You're welcome. And I'll give Richard your greeting.
Oh, yes.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Kelly.
See y'all later.
Bye.
Thanks, Don.
You betcha. Bye.